Flailing for the switch on his nightstand lamp, Noel listened to the thundering pace of his heart. Okay, that was alarming. Was that a dream? No, it couldn't have been a dream because Noel had never fallen asleep. He just started falling asleep. Noel stood up and got a bottle of water from his fridge, downing half of it. He sat on the edge of the bed and steadied his breathing. It took several minutes, and he tried not to notice his hand was shaking when he took another sip of water. Noel set down the water bottle, then said, "Get a grip." He lay down once more. "Let's try this again," Noel said to the room. He reached over and turned off the light. He closed his eyes. And someone, or something, opened the door to his room. Noel catapulted from the bed and knocked over his lamp, trying to turn it on. The bulb hit the wood floor and broke, so Noel ran across the room and flipped the wall switch. He was alone. The door to his room was closed, and it was locked. Noel stared at his door. What had just happened? Noel looked around. In spite of how ordinary it looked, his room was suddenly threatening. He needed a weapon. Keeping one eye on the door, Noel crossed to his closet and picked up his aluminum softball bat. Holding it like a club, he sidestepped to the door. He got a tighter grip on the bat, then unlocked the door and threw it open. The hallway was empty. Ominous music wafted up from the first floor. Lots of bass and percussion. Noel looked at his watch. The movie was probably still going. Noel backed into his room and closed the door. Locking it, he leaned against it and ran his hand through his hair. What was going on with him? Noel looked at his bed. Then he stared at the doorknob. No way he was going to sleep unless he secured his door better. Feeling like the idiot Sam used to say he was, Noel stepped over to his desk, grabbed his chair, and wedged the top of the back under the doorknob. Good thing he opted for a wooden chair instead of the plush one on wheels his mother thought he should get. Once the chair was in place, Noel looked at the shade over his window. The window was locked, right? Still clutching his softball bat, Noel checked the window. Yes, it was locked. Good. Now can you stop acting like a paranoid mental patient? He asked himself. He didn't answer himself because he had no idea if he could stop. It didn't seem to be in his control. Noel stood at the beginning of the room for several more minutes. Then he decided there was no way he was going to sleep. So he lighted his lamp and went into the closet for a broom, a dustpan, and a new bulb. After he cleaned up the broken bulb and put a new one in the lamp, he grabbed his laptop and got in bed with it. He might as well work on the new screenplay he was writing. He'd hoped it would be the script he and Sam would use for their midterm project. Now, Noel shrugged. Who knew what would become of it? But working on it might take his mind off the insanity, or make him sleepy. Whichever came first would be fine with him. It only took an hour for Noel to start nodding off. Encouraged by the silence, not just in his room, but in the frat house as a whole, Noel set aside his laptop, made sure his baseball bat was leaning handily against the side of his bed, and switched off his lamp. He immediately switched it back on. Was that a shadow he saw right as the light was going out? He scanned the room. Nothing, of course. Noel decided he needed a flashlight. His lamp might not survive the night if he kept lunging for it. Opening his nightstand drawer, Noel got out his flashlight he kept there for power outages. It was amazing how often one of his frat brothers overloaded the circuits and blew the breaker. Setting the flashlight on the nightstand, Noel looked around one more time, then gingerly laid his head on the pillow. He remained there a few minutes, about as relaxed as the wooden Indian he'd accused Sam of being. And that thought made him stiffen even more. His lungs seemed to have shrunk. They couldn't take in enough air. He tried to blank out his mind. Think of good things, his mom said when he was little, and he'd get upset. Then she'd sing that song she always sang when he needed cheering up. He never had the heart to tell her the song didn't do it for him. He wasn't fond of rainbows and kittens. But he did like Amber. He'd think about Amber. Amber had freckles, just a few of them. They crossed the bridge of her nose like bird tracks. Noel stiffened again. Ixnay on the Erd's Bay, Noel told himself. He tried again. So Amber had these freckles, and she had a matching trail of them across the top of her chest. He noticed them peeking out over the neckline of the white tank shirts Amber liked to wear. He also liked that about her. She stuck with jeans and white shirts. He never met a girl as unconcerned with fashion as she was. But she still managed to look great. Maybe it was the wild, shoulder-length, wavy blonde hair. Noel's eyelids started to droop. Trying not to hold his breath, he reached out and turned off his lamp. He lay still and listened. Nothing. Good. Noel closed his eyes. And the window swept open. Something hit the floor with a thud. Noel grabbed for his flashlight, and he ended up knocking it across the room. He heard it clatter against the far wall. Noel seized his bat in the dark with his right hand and felt, with his trembling left hand, for the light. He managed to turn it on without breaking the bulb. Light flooded the room and revealed nothing. What the hell? Noel yelled. He was sure he heard the window open. He knew he'd heard something hit the floor. Did he dream it? He shook his head. No way, it sounded too real. Crossing to the window, Noel checked the lock again. It was latched. Okay, fine. He'd sleep with the light on. Didn't he tell Ian he would sleep through pretty much anything? And he could, so he would. Noel retrieved his flashlight and set it on the nightstand. He repositioned his bat, and he lay down on his bed again. He looked at his watch. It was only 11:25. Could he call Amber? And say what? Want to come over and listen for invisible intruders with me? There was a line he'd never tried before. Noel threw his forearm over his eyes, but kept his eyes open. Why did he push Sam so hard yesterday? Noel rode over and punched the window. Is this really the time for psychoanalysis? He asked himself. He knew he shouldn't have taken that psychology class this semester. He did it because his advisor said psychology was helpful for all writers and filmmakers. He hadn't been prepared for how much it forced him to examine his own actions and motives. But since he didn't want to close his eyes yet, why not ask the hard questions? He'd known Sam was getting pissed off yesterday, but he kept needling him. Why? And even more important, why had he enjoyed bullying Christine so much in junior high? What was it about her that brought out that level of cruelty? Maybe because there was no doubt about it. He'd been cruel, both in junior high and the day before. What did he get from that? Did it make him feel better about himself? He tried to remember something useful from his Psych 201 lectures. Was it mirroring? No. That was when you acted like someone else. Was it projecting? No. Wasn't that putting your feelings off on someone else? Displacement. Getting closer. That was taking out your frustrations and impulses on someone or something less threatening than what's bothering you. Ah, he might be onto something. But he was so tired. Noel's eyes closed, and finally, he fell asleep. A screeching squeal somewhere between an alarm's buzz and a siren's wail, a sound that barely came in under ear-damaging levels, wrenched Noel from his cushy oblivion and hurled him back toward Earth. At the same time, a spine-scouring lightning strike burned an image of the Blackbird into Noel's brain, marking Noel's mind like a dreadful brand. Noel fought to find his way back to full consciousness, but he couldn't get all the way there. He was awake enough to know he had been dragged from sleep, but that was as far as he could go. It was like something was holding him in place, clamping him into restraints in a way stationed between thought and no thought. He felt literally pinned to his bed. He could even feel the stabbing pressure of something sharp digging into his skin at the wrist and ankles. He tried to buck off his assailant, but he couldn't move at all. He was utterly paralyzed. He could feel the pressure getting stronger and stronger, pushing him deeper into his mattress. He felt like he was being compressed into nothingness. And still, he tried to battle the force above him. He poured every ounce of his will into his muscles, and he grunted and strained to get free. His confinement got worse, not better. Noel suddenly sensed an evil presence hovering over him. No, not hovering. Sitting. The presence was sitting on Noel's bed. Sitting on Noel. It was pressing down on him, engulfing him, insinuating itself into every part of him. And then, with a flashlight, he was free. He busted loose from his bizarre captivity and awoke so fully that when he opened his eyes, he was completely alert. And he had his bat in his hands. This was a good thing, because Noel was not alone in his room. A demonic presence of tenebrous feathers was poised right above his head. So Noel swung the bat. In the nanosecond he swung, or was it the nanosecond before he swung, the thing above Noel's bed disappeared in an eruption of feathers that spewed throughout the room. Then the feathers vanished into nothingness. It happened so fast, Noel couldn't be sure it happened at all. All he could be sure of was that he did swing the bat. He knew this because his lamp hit the floor, and another bulb bit the dust. The time span in which Noel had seen the feather thing was infinitesimal. It wasn't even a second. Noel's room went from sound and havoc to utter silence and stillness in the blink of an eye. And yet that image of what Noel had seen in the blink was burned into his retinas. Because he hadn't just seen feathers. He'd also seen soul-drilling, malevolent yellow eyes and pointed, threatening beak. Those eyes had locked onto Noel's eyes. The sharp beak had aimed itself straight at Noel's guilty heart. Noel was sure it was a blackbird, leaning over him with malicious intent. This wasn't just a still shot. This was a complete horror film playing out behind his eyeballs, in the theater of his own mind. Without blood. Sam was right. You didn't need blood to have horror. The creep factor was horrifying enough. Noel emitted a sound that was a half moan and half laugh. It sounded like a strangled sob of an unhinged man. How strange that in just a few hours, Noel had gone from a well-adjusted college guy to a paranoid mental case. Because he had to be crazy, right? To believe the horror that he and Sam had crafted on the fly had come to life. Noel stood and paced around the room. Adrenaline was still coursing through his system, and he needed to get it out. After 3 U-shaped passes back and forth between his bed, Noel decided one thing. His room was not big enough for his nervous energy. So Noel strode into his closet and grabbed sweats, a t-shirt, a hoodie, socks, and running shoes. By the time Noel stepped into the bright hall, it was eerily silent in the frat house. He checked his watch again. It was almost 1 a.m. Wait a second, where did the last hour and a half go? Had Noel lain in bed thinking about psychology for that long? Or had he been in that incapacitated state longer than he thought? He had no idea. The hammering of his heart was drowning out any rational thought at the moment. Striding down the hall as quietly as possible, Noel darted to the stairs and ran down them without a sound. It wasn't that he cared about waking up his frat brothers. He didn't want to have to explain to anyone what he was doing. He just wanted to get away. As soon as he stepped through the heavy double doors and onto the broad front porch of the frat house, Noel rethought his actions. Did he really want to go running in the dark with this creature hounding him? What if this thing got tired of toying with him and decided to grab him? What if it seized him and took off, the way an eagle snatched a rodent? Now he did sound insane. Did he really think the Blackbird was going to fly over and steal him off the ground? Even if some frightful rendition of Sam and his costume was coming after Noel, that didn't mean it could fly, did it? Why not? If any of what happened today was possible, then anything could be possible. Noel turned and ran back up to his room. He spent the next 2 hours trying to stay awake. He was too terrified to try and sleep again. So he did push-ups and sit-ups. He listened to music. He played games on his computer. Finally, he started watching a movie. The movie was what did him in. He had to close his laptop and sleep overpowered him. As soon as Noel closed his eyes, the high-pitched caterwauling sound started again. He tried to cover his ears, but again he was paralyzed. Every time he tried to writhe against whatever force held him down, he had to push through the horror that still played in his head, the brutal eyes gazing into the murk of his very essence, the beak, like a scythe of judgment, cutting through his heart. In his benumbed consciousness, inky feathered shapes streaked toward him, then retreated, over and over. He felt like a fat, helpless worm inching through the dirt. The Blackbird was merely playing with him, before plucking him from the ground and swallowing him whole. The sound and the image were tearing him apart from the inside, And still he fought. Still he held in place. Until he wasn't. As before, Noel came back into the land of the living with a crack of radiant light and a gaping silence. As before, he was on his feet immediately. And as before, the evil trespasser disintegrated into oblivion, as if it was never there, which it clearly wasn't, even though every iota of Noel's being was arguing that it was. Noel was going to lose his mind if he didn't get out of this room. Once again, Noel opened his door and headed through the frat house. This time, when he got to the porch, he didn't let himself think. He just took off running to the brick path leading toward the quad. He had to get away, and that meant running. The campus was dead still. Noel couldn't even hear a car in the distance. He wouldn't have been surprised to find out that the campus had been isolated under a glass dome. But no, it was still in the real world. It seemed to be a perfectly normal campus hanging out on Earth. The night sky was black. Clouds must have blown in. Bushes gyrated in the breeze that hadn't been blowing a few hours before. An occasional torn poster or candy bar wrapper skittered over the bricks. The campus was lit by a series of wrought iron lampposts, which cast a mesh of shadow and light over the concrete and foliage. Noel found it mildly disorienting to look at. He seemed to see a feather in every blade of grass or errant branch. So, Noel kept his gaze directed at a spot on the ground 15 or so feet in front of him, to try and keep his focus and also center his thoughts. He'd been running as fast as he could, as if running for his life. Something was torturing him relentlessly. How could he escape it? For now, he'd run. Noel turned to look behind him, and his shoe caught a tree root. He tumbled off the path into the bushes. Lying on his back, holding a twisted ankle and wincing at the sharp pain that suggested he'd skin his knees and his elbows, Noel threw his head back and shouted, "Enough!" He closed his eyes, and the horrendous sounds started again. The chilling, feathered entity loomed over him. Noel opened his eyes, and of course, he was alone. Noel fought his way out of the bushes, thrashing to his feet, ignoring the throbbing pain in too many places to catalog. Noel said, "Sam, I'm sorry." Turning in a circle, Noel said it again and again, almost like a ritual. "Sam, I'm sorry." Quarter turn. "Sam, I'm sorry." Quarter turn. "Sam, I'm sorry." Closing his eyes for a fraction of a second, Noel confirmed what he had suspected, that his apologies weren't accomplishing anything at all. But he tried one more time. He threw his arms up to the sky and bellowed, "Sam, I'm sorry." This got a response. It got him a blinding flashlight beam in his face and a campus cop. "Are you drunk or high?" Noel rolled his eyes and faced the guy. He had dark skin and loosely cropped hair. An unimpressive badge was clipped to his belt. "Neither," he said. "I was having nightmares, so I went for a run." The campus cop shined his light from Noel's feet to the top of his head. Noel held his arms out away from his body. Hands open and showed he carried nothing. "What's your name?" The cop put the light back in Noel's eyes. Noel squinted and looked away, frowning out the spots that carveted across his retinas. But hey, maybe if he was blind, he wouldn't be able to see the Blackbird. Even thinking the name made the image reassert itself. "Name?" The cop repeated. "Noel Markman. Can you please not shine the light right in my eyes?" The cop lowered the flashlight beam. Noel couldn't see the cop's face very well, but he didn't look much older than Noel himself. He was much taller than Noel, though, and the way he loomed over the scene reminded Noel of... "Stop it," he commanded himself. "Why were you yelling?" the cop asked. "I was trying to get something out of my system." The cop whipped the light back into Noel's eyes. "Drugs?" "No, I'm not high. I'm not drunk. He hesitated. "I did something to piss off a friend, and he's mad at me. I don't know." The cop lowered the flashlight again. For a few minutes they stood in silence. Noel noticed crickets chirping, which he hadn't heard while he was running. Then the campus cop surprised him. He said, "I get that. You want to say you're sorry, but you're a little pissed that he's so pissed. So you kept yelling that you're sorry to get the anger out of your system." Noel lifted an eyebrow. Not bad for a campus cop. "That's exactly right. he said. Okay, well, do you think you're done yelling? Noel nodded. I can be, yes. Okay. Noel waited to be sure the guy was done with him. The cop gestured down the path with his flashlight. I suggest you keep running. It's a great way to get stuff out of your system. Yeah, thanks. They nodded at each other, and Noel headed off again. By the time he'd run a mile, the barest hint of pale pink was touching at the top of the hills at the east edge of town. Dawn was coming, and Noel hadn't really slept at all. Was he ever going to sleep again? He had to let Sam know he was sorry, some other way than by screaming in the middle of campus. But how? Noel was running back toward his frat house when he heard footfalls approaching from the left. Slowly, trying not to quake in fear, Noel glanced at the direction of the footfalls. He tried to tell himself it sounded like a person, not a bird, and he was right. Noel! For the first time in hours, Noel relaxed. He didn't relax completely, but he let go of enough anxiety to unkink the muscles in his neck and shoulders. Hi, Amber. Amber jogged in place in front of him, wearing dark blue sweats and a white t-shirt. She was just starting to work up a sheen of sweat. I've never seen you running in the morning before, Amber said. I don't run in the morning. Ah, so this must be another of your clones? Noel smiled. And when he realized how good it felt to smile, he smiled wider. Yes? How many do you have? As many as I need for all the things I don't do. Amber laughed. Do you want to run with me, Noel's clone? Sure. Why not? Noel wasn't ready, not even a little, to face his day. He hadn't come to terms with the night. When they were finished running, they ended up at the cafeteria again. We have to stop meeting like this. Amber used the hem of her shirt to wipe the sweat from her face. I've never met you here before, he said. That was Noel's other clone. Right, I forgot. The cafeteria doors were just opening. An enticing bacon aroma wafted through the double doors. Only a few bleary-eyed students were starting to straggle toward the building. Amber put her foot up on the railing along the side of the stairs and bent over to stretch. Noel felt sweat trickling down his spine. He closed his eyes for a second and then immediately opened them wide to try to wake himself up. Then he wiped his eyes. They were dry and scratchy. Are you okay? Amber asked. I mean, seriously, you don't look too good. Well, thanks. Amber gave him a half smile. You know what I mean. Your eyes are really red. I haven't slept. All night? Noel shook his head. Anything I can do? Noel studied her. It was funny. Just now, he realized she reminded him a little Christine, the girl he bullied in junior high. She had similar coloring, and her mouth was the same shape. He wondered if that's why he'd never thought of her as pretty until recently. Amber had been in one of several of his classes, both the previous year and this one. And he'd never given her a second glance until a couple of days before. Now, he realized, he liked her a lot. With this came trust, so he blurted, How would you fix it if you did something really wrong and it was a long time ago, but then you did again recently and you can't apologize to the person you just did it to, but you're sorry and you want to make amends somehow? Amber tilted her head and pursed her lips. Guilt is keeping you awake? Something like that. Amber sat on one of the concrete steps and patted the space next to her. Noel acknowledged a greeting from a friend and sat next to Amber. The concrete was cold and damp. It's nice that you feel guilt. It shows character. A lot of guys are too stupid to know that they should feel guilty. I might have thought you were one of those. So why'd you want to go out with me? I might have thought I was wrong. Noel wasn't sure she was. Did he feel guilty because he had character? Or maybe he just didn't want to get murdered by the Blackbird. I think guilt is like a weed. Amber lifted her face to the sun, which was starting to climb above the tops of the trees. It's best to pluck it out at the root. So apologize to the first person I need to apologize to, Noel said. But how does that make amends with the second person? Amber said, it's an energy thing. Yin and yang. Balance the scale in one place, and the balance radiates outward. Noel wasn't so sure about that. But he had to do something. There you are. Noel turned around at the sound of a girl's voice. It was Darla and their friend group. She pointed at Amber and said, you weren't where we always meet. Amber jumped up. Sorry, it's his fault. She pointed at Noel and grinned. He stood too. I need a shower. Amber nodded and headed toward her friends. She turned back. Good luck. Thanks. He knew he was going to need it.